He walked in wearing a MAGA hat, polite, patient, and quiet. But the bank manager didn't see a customer. He saw a stereotype. With a smirk and a snub, he denied service outright. What he didn't know, the man in the hat wasn't there to open an account. He owned the building they worked in and the entire bank they served under. It began like any ordinary business hour, phones ringing, keyboards clattering, and customers filtering in and out with their financial needs. But the moment a man in a simple red MAGA hat stepped through the glass doors, the atmosphere subtly shifted. Conversations slowed. Eyes flicked. Smirks surfaced. What should have been an unremarkable visit quickly became a study in modern prejudice, dressed in suits and spreadsheets. The man's appearance didn't scream wealth or influence. He wore a flannel shirt, jeans, and well-worn boots. No flashy watch, no designer briefcase, just the calm presence of someone who had seen enough of life to not care how others saw him. But to the bank manager watching from her polished corner office, he was already filed into a category: rural, outdated, political. She didn't see a customer. She saw a headline. She didn't bother to greet him personally. Instead, she sent a junior staffer, clearly uncomfortable, to handle it. As the man approached the counter with patience and respect, he was met not with professionalism, but with a frozen smile and vague instructions to wait. The line behind him moved, but he remained untouched by service, intentionally overlooked. When he politely asked to speak with the branch manager, the response came like a door slammed in the face. "She's busy and can't help you. Maybe try a bank more suited to your needs." The tone wasn't subtle. It dripped with mockery. The staff's eyes flickered toward the manager's desk, where she offered a self-satisfied glance of approval. Some employees chuckled quietly. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Customers nearby looked on, sensing the tension, but unsure whether to intervene or mind their own business. The man remained calm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply stood there, steady, dignified, and visibly unwelcome. The manager eventually emerged from her office, walking with the pride of someone convinced of her own authority. She looked the man up and down, barely concealing her disdain. Without asking for his name, reason, or intention, she dismissed him in front of everyone. "We reserve the right to refuse service," she said sharply. "This is a professional institution. You should know that appearance and behavior matter here." Her words landed not just on the man, but on the ears of everyone present. In that moment, she wasn't just rejecting a customer, she was making a performance out of it. And to her, it felt like a victory, a statement, a warning to anyone else who might dare walk in without fitting her silent dress code of approval. She turned her back before he could respond. But the man didn't need to respond. His silence spoke volumes. Without protest, he turned and walked toward the exit. He didn't flinch. He didn't look back. He simply left, as if the entire ordeal had confirmed something he already knew. The illusion of equality was often paper-thin, especially in places built on perceived status. The aftermath was quiet, but telling. Employees whispered. Customers glanced at one another. Some were clearly disturbed by what they'd just witnessed. A few murmured that it was over the line, while others rationalized it with comments about company policy or brand image. The manager returned to her office feeling untouchable, unaware that her assumption that this man was just another nuisance in a red hat was about to become the biggest mistake of her career. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't care where he came from. She didn't bother to consider what brought him there that day. To her, his hat said everything she needed to know. She saw a stereotype, not a person, and in her eagerness to send a message, she ignored the most important detail. Appearances can deceive, but arrogance always reveals itself. The man's quiet departure wasn't a retreat. It was restraint. It was the calm before a reckoning. And though the staff returned to their routine and the manager basked in self-satisfaction, the foundation beneath their comfort had already begun to crack. The man they had refused service wasn't looking for attention. He didn't need to make a scene to command respect. He already had something far greater than their approval. He had ownership, power, and the patience to let the truth unfold on its own terms. In the coming days, their world would change, but for now, they thought they had won. They thought they had judged correctly. They thought the hat told the whole story. They were wrong. Whispers always follow injustice, even in polished places where professionalism is preached and appearances are everything. After the dismissal, the bank returned to its mechanical rhythm. Transactions processed, papers shuffled, smiles forced, but beneath the surface, the air had shifted. What once was routine now carried an undercurrent of discomfort. Conversations became hushed, eyes darted more cautiously. The moment the door closed behind the man in the red hat, silence wasn't relief, it was tension. Among the employees, there were those who felt uneasy but kept their heads down. The manager's authority was ironclad, and her confidence made disagreement feel dangerous. She strutted through the office with the air of someone who believed they'd taken a stand, someone convinced they'd just defended the institution against an unwanted disruption. Her smirk lingered longer than necessary. Her voice carried louder than before. She wasn't just proud, she was emboldened. Some employees, however, weren't so quick to celebrate. Quiet conversations sprang up in corners and break rooms. "Did you see how he didn't even react?" one asked. "He looked important." Another murmured, "I don't think this is over." Something didn't sit right about the way he walked away. Curiosity, once sparked, grows fast in closed spaces. It was a junior clerk, diligent, cautious, and usually invisible, who finally decided to follow that uneasy feeling. They didn't want trouble. They only wanted clarity. The dismissal had been loud, public, and final. But something about the man's demeanor, his stillness, his refusal to defend himself, hadn't matched the manager's assumption. So, the clerk did what no one else dared. They quietly pulled up the internal system. In most banks, sensitive client data is locked behind multiple barriers. But some names are flagged, important, high-level, or tied to institutional interests. The system gives priority access for risk alerts or confidential activity. As the clerk typed a few details, the system hesitated, then populated with restricted access data. The screen flashed a name that matched, accompanied by a classification rarely seen by regular staff. The man was not just a customer. He wasn't just a high-net-worth individual. He was a stakeholder, a major one. His profile carried internal flags reserved for board-level executives, silent partners, or owners. There were records of direct wire transfers to parent financial holdings, coded communications from corporate headquarters, and investment activity that traced back years. The name wasn't new. It was woven deep into the institution's roots. The realization hit like a thunderclap. The man who had been publicly denied service was, on record, one of the bank's most powerful silent players. He had influence beyond the branch, beyond the manager, beyond anyone currently clocked in. He wasn't looking for help. He had the power to approve or deny operational funding. His ownership stake wasn't ceremonial. It was decisive. The clerk didn't speak a word. They closed the system, logged out, and sat frozen, unsure whether to tell anyone or stay quiet. In a workplace where challenging leadership could mean unemployment, silence felt safer. But wordless tension has a way of spreading. Without anyone naming it, the mood began to sour. Staff who had laughed quietly during the dismissal now avoided eye contact. Those who'd ignored the scene began piecing it together, sensing they might have witnessed a catastrophic misjudgment. By the end of the day, eyes began glancing toward the glass doors more frequently, half expecting the man to return. But he didn't. There were no angry phone calls, no social media posts, no immediate fallout. That absence made it worse. The longer the silence stretched, the more ominous it became. Every second of calm felt like a delay before a storm. The manager, however, remained unmoved. Her pride had fossilized into arrogance. She believed she'd made a strong example, that her decision would resonate upward as discipline, not discrimination. When subtle changes in employee behavior reached her attention, she dismissed them as workplace gossip. Her belief in her infallibility had become a shield, one that kept her blind, even as the structure around her began to tremble. Elsewhere, however, the internal discovery had already triggered alerts. Corporate oversight systems were designed to monitor activity tied to high-level stakeholders. When the clerk accessed the profile, it sent an automatic ping up the chain, not an emergency alert, but a subtle flag that someone had touched information reserved for executive awareness. That ping wouldn't go unnoticed. At first, it would be treated like a blip, a standard system interaction. But with each hour, more pieces would start falling into place: security logs, employee behavior notes, anonymous reports. The man's quiet exit had activated more than whispers. It had activated protocol, silent, digital, and undeniable. The storm hadn't hit yet, but the wind had shifted, and in a world built on reputation and compliance, the cost of one person's arrogance was about to echo far beyond that lobby floor. The first tremor didn't come from gossip, nor from social media fallout. It came directly from a number the corporate office had flagged in red, a private contact reserved for high-level communication only. When that number lit up the executive line, the assistant on duty didn't hesitate. The call didn't get screened. It got transferred, directly, immediately. The voice on the other end was calm, no raised tones, no dramatic storytelling, just precision, clarity, and control. The man in the MAGA hat didn't introduce himself as someone wronged. He didn't posture, threaten, or rage. He simply stated his name, his stake, and the facts. He outlined the experience not from emotion, but from principle. What happened wasn't just unprofessional, it was a violation of brand values, customer dignity, and leadership accountability. And he wasn't asking for an apology, he was asking for an internal audit. The moment the words majority shareholder were confirmed by internal records, the tone inside headquarters changed. Executives who had been in meetings about quarterly performance now turned their full attention to the unfolding issue. His name wasn't just familiar, it was foundational. He wasn't a newcomer to the institution. He was one of the strategic forces behind its expansion, one of the unseen hands who had helped steer the bank through turbulent markets, mergers, and growth. His silence over the years had been interpreted as detachment. In reality, it was trust. And now that trust had been breached, emails began to fly within minutes. A chain reaction of urgency pulsed through each department: compliance, HR, public relations, risk management. Legal teams were looped in. A summary of the incident was pieced together not from the man's own retelling, but from the internal footage, employee reports, and client activity logs. The truth didn't need dressing. It spoke for itself. The footage showed the interaction in stark clarity: dismissal without inquiry, humiliation without cause, arrogance without understanding. There was no excuse that could cushion the fallout. The manager's behavior, once perceived as firm leadership, now stood as a direct threat to corporate integrity. Her assumption hadn't just offended a customer, it had jeopardized investor confidence. The man's request wasn't for a performance review. It was for systemic evaluation. He questioned whether leadership at the local level had been vetted properly, whether diversity training had been real or performative, whether the bank's values had become hollow slogans plastered on brochures rather than lived principles in branches. By the time the board of directors was briefed, the tone was no longer reactive, it was corrective. The incident had touched something deeper than customer service. It had struck at the core of brand identity. A company that prided itself on discretion, respect, and merit had allowed ego and politics to poison its front lines. And the man who had walked out without raising his voice now held the company's conscience in his hands. Meetings were canceled. Flights were booked. Executives were mobilized, not as a PR stunt, but as damage control of the highest order. The risk wasn't just reputational, it was structural. One misstep had revealed not just an isolated mistake, but a potential crack in leadership culture. If arrogance had taken root at one branch, how many others had gone unnoticed? The man made no demands for firings. He never once uttered the name of the manager who denied him. His focus remained on standards. He requested written evaluations of hiring protocols, leadership training, and customer interaction frameworks. He asked for transparency, not in media statements, but in internal reports. His approach wasn't vengeful. It was surgical, and it was terrifyingly effective. Corporate didn't ask for time. They asked for forgiveness. Quietly, urgently, they offered to convene a special board session to discuss his concerns. They proposed new initiatives to reinforce customer respect across all branches. They offered him frontline reports, audit access, and full visibility into the corrective actions being planned. He didn't interrupt. He listened. And when they asked what he wanted in return, his answer was simple: excellence. Not one executive dared to downplay the situation. The gravity of the call wasn't in what was said, but in who was saying it. A man who could have destroyed reputations with a single tweet had instead chosen a more devastating path, holding them to their own mission statement. He didn't seek public revenge. He sought corporate integrity, and in doing so, he became the measuring stick they had forgotten. By nightfall, the internal temperature had shifted. Managers across the region received notices about mandatory leadership reviews. The culture that once celebrated fast judgment was now being audited for slow rot. No one said man's name. They didn't need to. He had become the force behind every correction, every apology, every hurried executive action. He hadn't needed to raise his voice. His silence had been loud enough. The following morning, a sense of unease permeated the air at the bank's headquarters. The routine that had resumed after the previous day's events now felt fragile, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The employees, who had been uncomfortable with the manager's actions but unsure of what to do, now found themselves caught in an invisible web of anticipation. The decisions of the previous day, actions taken with an air of unshakable confidence, were about to come under scrutiny. Behind the scenes, the corporate office had been hard at work. An emergency board meeting had been scheduled at the branch itself, a rare and dramatic decision. Executives, legal teams, and the high-ranking officials who usually conducted business behind closed doors now found themselves summoned to the very location where the scandal had erupted. The room they would meet in had never before felt so ominous, so full of pressure. The manager, still basking in the false comfort of her previous decisions, arrived at the branch with the same arrogance that had led her to dismiss the man in the MAGA hat. She didn't know what was coming. As far as she was concerned, her role was secure. She had done what she thought was right, defended the institution from what she believed to be an intrusion. She couldn't fathom that her actions had begun a ripple effect that would crash over her head like a tidal wave. She walked into the meeting room with her usual poise, the soft click of her heels against the marble floor echoing in the silent space. She was greeted by the stark faces of the executives, their usual pleasantries absent. But she didn't sense the tension. After all, she had nothing to worry about. That was until the door opened behind her and the sound of footsteps, confident, purposeful, made her pause. When the man in the red MAGA hat entered, the entire room froze. The atmosphere, already tense, became suffocating. He wasn't alone. Behind him, the board of directors filed in, their faces a blend of professionalism and silent discomfort. It wasn't the kind of group one would expect at a regular executive meeting, especially not at a branch. These were the heavyweights, the key players who made decisions that affected millions. Their presence was deliberate, and their presence signaled a change in the power dynamics she had so confidently controlled. He was introduced not just as a customer, not even just as an investor. The words spoken next would forever shift the ground beneath her feet. This is Mr. Thomas Redwood. He is the majority shareholder of this bank and the key stakeholder overseeing this branch's leadership evaluation, the head of the board said, his voice steady but laced with an unmistakable edge of authority. He will be conducting a thorough review of all operations here. The words rang out like a verdict, sealing her fate before she could respond. She didn't need to hear anything more. The shock hit her first. Then came the realization. He wasn't just someone she had turned away. He was the very reason the institution existed. The same man she had dismissed so carelessly, assuming him to be beneath her notice, was the one who now held her future in his hands. Her face, once marked with the pride of a manager in control, now betrayed every ounce of her shock. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Her body stiffened, as if trying to fight the crushing weight of the moment. The calm arrogance that had guided her actions now crumbled, replaced by a stark vulnerability. For the first time, she realized she was no longer the one in control. The tide had turned, and she was the one about to be swept away. The man, Thomas Redwood, didn't look at her with anger, nor did he offer any hint of retribution. He simply stood there, poised and quiet, as the full scope of his presence settled in. His gaze didn't waver. He wasn't there for revenge. He wasn't there to shame her publicly. His approach was far more calculated than that. The message was clear. He didn't need to act out of spite. He simply needed to hold up the mirror to the institution she had so carelessly represented. As the room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the executives took their seats, their eyes briefly flickering between Redwood and the manager. They didn't need to say anything. The gravity of the situation was already palpable. The manager's fate hung on the decisions of someone she had dismissed so easily. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to defend herself, perhaps to apologize, but no words came out. Her voice had abandoned her. In its place was the realization that this was bigger than any single interaction. This wasn't just about one customer's complaint. This was about leadership accountability and the trust that had been violated. And in that room, with Redwood standing at the center of it all, she was exposed. "I'm not here to make an example of anyone." Redwood's voice finally broke the silence, cool and composed. "I'm here because what happened yesterday should never happen again. This bank was built on values of respect, discretion, and excellence. When those values are violated, there are consequences. This isn't personal. This is about ensuring that everyone who walks through this door, no matter their appearance, receives the respect they deserve. It's about making sure that the people responsible for upholding those values are held accountable." With those words, the path ahead was laid out. The bank was no longer a place where arrogant leaders could hide behind their titles. It was a place where integrity would now be the standard, and anyone who couldn't meet that standard would face the consequences. The manager understood, in that moment, that her time at the bank was nearing its end. The facade she had built around herself had shattered. The man in the MAGA hat wasn't just her customer, he was her reckoning. In the days following the fateful meeting, the ripple effect of the events that transpired spread rapidly. It wasn't long before news outlets picked up the story, turning a local incident into a national conversation. The bank, once seen as a pillar of corporate respectability, had inadvertently opened a window into the stark realities of bias and prejudice in the workplace. A simple interaction between a man in a MAGA hat and a bank manager had become the catalyst for an intense public examination of leadership, professionalism, and institutional values. The MAGA hat, which had initially been seen as a symbol of division, now took on a new meaning. It became a symbol not of political affiliation, but of something deeper: the dangerous assumptions that come with judging others based on appearances. The public outcry was not just about a single individual's experience. It was a collective condemnation of an entrenched mindset that allowed discrimination to go unchecked in seemingly neutral spaces. The bank, in its effort to restore its tarnished reputation, launched an aggressive campaign to restructure its policies and internal culture. The CEO released a public statement acknowledging the failure in leadership and the harmful effects of bias, while offering a formal apology to not just the individual involved, but to every customer who had ever been made to feel less than. The statement was followed by an extensive reform plan aimed at eradicating discriminatory practices across the organization. Anti-discrimination training was introduced as a mandatory program for all employees, from frontline workers to top-level executives. The bank began hosting workshops on diversity, equity, and inclusion, ensuring that each staff member understood their role in creating an environment where all customers, regardless of their background or political beliefs, felt valued and respected. These initiatives, however, weren't just about addressing one bad experience. They were about reshaping the culture of the organization, transforming it from a place where biases were allowed to thrive into a model of accountability and fairness. But the reforms were only one part of the story. The real transformation came in the bank's new leadership approach, an approach that placed character, humility, and respect at the forefront. The bank began to focus on promoting leaders who exemplified these values, not simply those who excelled in financial acumen or customer service metrics. Managers and executives were encouraged to lead by example, to listen before reacting, and to ensure that every person who entered their doors, regardless of their station or appearance, received the same standard of respect and consideration. While the institution underwent its transformation, the man who had inadvertently triggered the chain of events, Thomas Redwood, remained largely out of the spotlight. He didn't seek accolades, nor did he use his newfound influence to push for personal gain. Instead, he chose to quietly guide the process from behind the scenes. His actions spoke louder than any statement of self-congratulation could have. He didn't want to be remembered as the man who corrected a wrong. He wanted to be remembered as the one who laid the foundation for a new standard of corporate responsibility. His focus remained on the long-term impact of his actions, not on short-term satisfaction. Under his quiet guidance, the bank's customer satisfaction rating soared. It wasn't just about numbers, it was about the tangible shift in customer experience. Former clients returned with renewed trust, bringing their business back to a place where they now saw real, positive change. Redwood's leadership became a case study for how a company could turn a public relations disaster into an opportunity for genuine cultural growth. But not everyone shared in the bank's redefined legacy. The manager who had once dismissed him, the very woman who had sparked the chain of events, found herself removed from her position. She was no longer seen as a respected manager, nor a professional leader. Her role at the bank, once considered secure, was now a distant memory. Her name had become synonymous with the poor judgment and arrogance that led to her undoing. Her termination was a consequence of more than just one single incident. It was a reflection of the broader failure in the system she represented. Despite her managerial position, her failure to recognize the value of diversity, her inability to see beyond her biases, and her unwillingness to learn from her mistake were all factors that led to her downfall. The lesson she would leave behind wasn't one of professional success, but one of a lost opportunity. She became the cautionary tale that executives would point to in the future when discussing the importance of empathy, respect, and humility in leadership. Her story was the reminder that titles alone didn't define leadership. It was the ability to recognize the worth of every individual, to treat others with dignity, and to understand the broader impact of one's actions that separated effective leaders from those who failed to adapt. In this new world that Redwood had helped create, her name would forever be associated with what happened when a leader refused to evolve. While some questioned whether the reforms would truly stick, time proved that they weren't just a reactionary measure. The changes were systemic, deep-rooted in the bank's renewed identity. Redwood's quiet but steady leadership had ensured that the legacy of this incident wasn't just a passing moment of controversy. It became the cornerstone of the bank's transformation into an organization that stood for fairness and accountability. It became a place where no one, no matter their appearance, beliefs, or background, was ever again judged unfairly. For Redwood, the story had come full circle. He had walked into the bank as a man in a hat, dismissed without question. And by the time the dust had settled, he had left behind a legacy that would define an era for the bank. Not one of power gained through public spectacle or aggressive confrontation, but one of quiet, lasting change built on the foundation of respect, accountability, and leadership done right. Don't let this story be forgotten. Like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on more powerful stories of transformation.